So I think it's more about how do we pivot away from their anger and get to a place of like, but our shared vision as Oklahomans is this. We're going to have a comment or an observation?
A unique opportunity, the NCAA Women's Basketball Tournament Final Four is in Minneapolis. And we should figure out what we do about that. That's going to be coming up in a couple of weeks, so FYI.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I didn't know that.
Yes.
Thank you for raising that. Can we flip to the next slide? Okay, so Kim Davis. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry, friends. I'm sorry. But that's the exact reaction I was looking for, because if you take one thing away from this session, aside from the freedom of religion is important, that's why it's already protected by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The second thing should be, we don't need to talk about Kim Davis. We don't need to talk about her. Because while Kim Davis is having her religious freedom consequences in the way that she talks about it, do you all know who this person is? Does anybody in the room know who this person is?
No.
Okay. So this is Lisa Marie Pond. This story always hits me in my heart. Lisa Marie Pond died alone in a hospital after she had a brain aneurysm in Florida. And the nurses would not let her partner or her family come visit her, even though they had the stack of papers. You know, that the lawyers always tell us, get the stack of papers, it will protect you. It did not protect Lisa. She died alone. Because the hospital said, we don't do that gay stuff, that kind of gay stuff here. So we're not even dealing with that, right? So when we're thinking about consequences, we were talking about our families, okay? And this is the other thing that comes out of the testing, is people think things like Kim Davis are probable to happen. So they acknowledge, yeah, Kim Davis can be a jerk to you. Yeah, that person in rural North Carolina, they might deny you a marriage license, but it's not that bad. That's their thinking. It's probable, it's plausible, but it's not that harmful, okay? So when we talk about our consequences attached to these laws, so the first thing that we do is we talk about shared values, that's already protected, is great, but then we need to, sort of amplify things, kind of your point of but let's talk about some real consequences. We need to be talking about things that are probable, that they happen, and they're really, really harmful, right? So the best sort of pro tip we could have here is getting legal advice about your specific legislation in your state about what those consequences could look like, because it's going to look different based on the piece of legislation, right? So you don't want to go out there and start talking about somebody like Lisa Marie's case, and then that's not actually a potential consequence of the law, because it just undermines your credibility. So before you start talking about consequences, really having a good sense from the ACLU, from the local state equality groups, about what could these consequences look like under this proposed legislation. And so yeah, her partner of 18 years was not able to see her, and she died alone. So the top testing consequences, and this is such a crummy way to think about it because we're talking about our families and lives, but they are the top testing messages, is safety and health, so this, domestic violence, so a talking point around that is a father could discipline his wife and his kids in the way that he sees fit because of his religious beliefs under this proposed legislation. So that tested really, really high, basically saying you could be a child abuser or negligent to children under this proposed law. That's how we got it killed in Oklahoma. The next one is a church leader because of the implicit abuse in the Catholic Church. And then the last one is reproductive health. So not around abortion, but bringing up the idea of a rape victim being denied Plan B because the healthcare provider doesn't believe in providing those types of medications, those medically necessary interventions, right? The bottom testing consequences, while they're plausible, they're not alarming, state officials. Number 2, florists. So it's not about cakes, it's about Lisa Marie, okay? Landlords being kicked out of your house, and unfortunately employers. These things don't test super well, but if you really want to get people in their gut, you would talk about Lisa Marie, children being abused, this idea around women not getting access to health care that's medically necessary. So it's not just about wedding cakes, it's about potential health care denial, And it's about us alleviating some discomfort and mentioning the discrimination, but just doing a light touch on it, right? Because we've already given them such a hard treatment, just a little bit of a light touch on what this consequence could look like. Okay, so we're about to pitch to the part where it's your turn, but let's go ahead and break and have some discussion real quick. Yeah, go ahead.
It might seem a little out of place, but my comment is when we are talking about religious freedom and religious exemption, seems to be, it sounds like it's synonymous with Christianity, and so maybe an argument to attack that would be that not all religion is Christian. There are some other religions that some people may have strong objection to, and if you pass these laws and you pass these this discrimination, these bills, then what about people who are Muslim and may deny service to women because they're not covering their heads, for example?
Yeah.
Something like that. I mean, is that what they really want?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic observation and argument. Also something that was used when we lobbied legislators in Oklahoma. Was sort of broadening the scope and talking about that. And the other thing I would say is it's really helpful if we do not repeat that it's religious freedom. That's their top testing message. So if you talk about it as a religious exemption or a refusal to provide services, that's our frame. They're asking for, exemptions. You know how they used to accuse us of wanting special rights? They still do. They're asking for exemptions.
Can you talk just briefly a little bit more about the messaging surrounding domestic violence? I'm surprised that's one of the top ones because North Carolina law actually discriminates against same-sex couples for protective orders.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So it's called a 50B order.
Okay.
It's a form of protective order that you can get if you're in certain domestic violence situations.
Okay.
And one of the situations is if you're an opposite sex couple in a dating situation. And the 50B order provides more protections than a normal protective order would. So
Okay.
if your neighbor's bothering you. And so it's actually, and I know, like I'm at Legal Aid, I know people on the ground have been fighting it, but as far as I know, it hasn't been reversed or been ruled unconstitutional. So right now, state law discriminates in the domestic violence laws themselves. So I'm curious, like how
Because the statute itself is gendered?
Yes, well, it specifically excludes, it says opposite sex couples. Sorry, it says
Yeah.
you have to be an opposite sex couple in a dating situation.
Yeah.
But married same-sex couples can still get a 50B.
Yes, but not if you're
It's
dating.
the dating relationship.
And you can't, it's complicated. But what I'm saying is discrimination is already written into domestic violence laws. So if you could talk a little bit more about the messaging, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, the messaging definitely does not anticipate, that type of statutory circumstance, right? It's more of a broader, think about a world in which, a father or a mother is disciplining their child in a way that their religion tells them that it's okay, right? And we've seen cases, like out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where federal courts have said, you may be a Christian Scientist, but that doesn't mean that you can't treat that you have a religious exemption from getting your child treated, right? So a child died while they were in foster custody because the family was Christian Science, and the family said, but we're Christian Science, we don't believe in getting medical care in that way. And the court said, that's great for you, but the child was in your care and they needed, really important intervention as a result of not getting that, they died. So I think that's what the messaging is, just a broader, can you imagine a world in which this would happen? And I think in a state like Oklahoma, people could imagine that world. Maybe in North Carolina, that resonates with you. But domestic violence is an issue that I've seen across the South. So it's something that we talk about in the testing in that way.
And I personally think that just North Carolina courts have some catching up to do. Everything from like the birth certificates to how we handle divorce, Rule 50B, like those are things that I definitely think we need to be nudging them to come along with, with the federal law of marriage being applicable to all couples, whether same sex or not. But I think that's just a byproduct of them just, kind of dragging their feet to change forms and to update statutes.
And also just remember that most general audiences aren't gonna know any of this nuanced stuff. Like, a lot of people, polls show, think it's illegal to fire someone based on sexual orientation in North Carolina, which is not true, you know, or in half the states. So there are perceptions about where the laws are that might not reflect reality. And I think, as Amanda said, you know, if you talk in general and certain types of examples, they can be really compelling.
Yeah, and a lot of the times this is for a letter to the editor or local news, and sort of how that, or a one-on-one conversation. A lot of the stuff that you say gets edited out anyway. You had a comment and then.
So, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer,
Yeah.
but I'm from Georgia.
Oh.
And we had a really bad week this week.
Yeah, you did. Why don't you tell everybody in the room about what happened this week?
So, we've been fighting this bill for 3 years, and it's come back in very many different forms. And I've been working on it and coordinating with the Jewish community and a bunch of others. And we got it so that it was pretty much buried about 2 or 3 weeks ago. After it passed the Senate, it was, you know, we got 75,000 letters to the governor, and the governor said, no way I'm signing it like that. And so the Republicans had a very secret meeting, and on Wednesday, with about an hour's notice, they introduced a new version, the 4th version this session of the bill with an amendment. We got a copy of it 20 minutes before it was voted on. It sailed through the House after an hour's conversation. It then moved over to the Senate. The Democrats offered for amendments, but because of the original number of the bill, it was originally engrossed, so they couldn't even offer those amendments, so those were all ruled to be out of order. And it sailed through the Senate also. And it's now sitting on the governor's desk ready to sign, and it's actually worse than it was before, but they sold it because they said that it's a compromise bill. And by compromise, they meant they took 3 various religious exemption laws and put them together, rather than just having one. So it's 3 times as bad. And they also played a trick on us. They said that it can't be used for any invidious discrimination based on, as written by state and federal laws. And Georgia is one of 5 states without any state non-discrimination laws whatsoever. And you all know that there are no LGBT discrimination laws federal at all, and the ones that do exist are local. So they made it look like it's a non-discrimination bill, but it's actually not. So right now, all we're doing is counting the governor, because it's just in his hands. He is literally the only person that we can turn to, and every single agency in the world that you want to turn out has turned out. Apple, NFL, all the sports teams, Delta, Coke, UPS, everyone, 480 companies have all come out against the bill, and no one seems to care at all. So we're kind of just sitting here hoping at this
Welcome
point.
to North Carolina.
This bill's actually worse than what y'all had.
Oh, they're still working.
Yeah.
I think we could all argue that our state has the worst
Yeah.
legislation because it feels
actually
really
called
terrible
worse,
to us. Let's go over here and then over to this side of the
I
room.
just had a question about the wording about the religious freedom thing.
Uh-huh.
Religious exemption and religious.
Refusals, right.
Okay, yeah. I
So-
just wanted to get the wording right.
Yeah, so they say religious freedom. That's what we should have named this. They say, we say. They say religious freedom, we say religious exemption. Okay? So that's because it clearly causes people to go, wait, what do you mean by an exemption? Or if you're tired of saying exemption, you could say refusal. It doesn't test as high. There's a couple of other things that you can say about these laws that are quick off the cuff. You could say, this law opens a can of worms. We don't know what kind of consequences it causes. That test's really high. You could say it opens the floodgates. What's next? I don't know what's in your conscience, right? So sort of what's next, kind of causing them to take a more defensive ground.
But on the floodgates thing, going into how they could deny interracial marriages and that kind of thing probably is effective.
Yeah, so, and this is where I would just say, little flag, make sure that you're talking to attorneys who can read the legislation, make sure that you've got a good understanding of what statute is before you say this is going to be a huge consequence. Otherwise, they're going to be like, oh my gosh, you're so hyperbolic. That's not true, right? So I could see the attorney in the back of the room be like, yes.
Question about it too.
Yes.
I'm so struck by how brazen discrimination has become again. I mean, it's not that it never wasn't, but something like saying, well, this could lead to magistrates allowing themselves to refuse a marriage license to an interracial couple. I could see some places where they'd be like, yeah,
Yeah, right?
that's where we're at.
But like, heck yeah.
And I'm
Well,
just
yeah.
curious, like, if you, in your data, in your testing, like, if you're seeing any of that, or if there's any takeaways you can share with us about when and how that message does or doesn't work.
Not specifically.
Yeah.
Those folks
Dig
probably
into
aren't
it.
the movable middle.
Yeah, they're not the movable, but I mean,
Yeah.
who in this room is from Alabama? Right, Alabama, there's some probate judges who just like stopped issuing any marriage licenses at all. They're like, we're done,
Right.
chapter's closed. So there's a few comments, questions over here, and then we'll get into sort of workshopping it.
I'm Todd Allen from the ACLU of Mississippi, and I do think we have the prize.
Woo!
Thank God for Alabama.
We're the workshop it too, just everybody go run for that trophy.
We're the only state in the South that's actually losing people, genuinely moving out because of the discrimination, because of what's going on. But I'm also a Southern Baptist minister, although
And you work at the ACLU?
I'm an ordained Southern Baptist minister.
Okay.
And I work at the ACLU. And there's not a Southern Baptist church to let me in anymore. But there are about 10 churches in Jackson, okay, that do same-gender weddings. Okay, so I just wanted us to think about this for a minute. Imagine that each church is a place of blessing for a variety of personal beliefs, right? We just take that approach. The way that discrimination happens in Mississippi and across the world is that you give the illusion of uniformity. You know, everybody's the same. If you're white, you think this way. If you're black, you think this way. If you're Christian, you think this way. And that illusion can be broken by talking about churches as having these individual beliefs. And then go from there to say, can every Mississippi church expect that a couple who has completed prayerful pre-marriage counseling have the same right to marry as a Muslim couple who walks into the Hinds County Courthouse? And my point is, there are couples that will be denied all the services that are listed in our bill, which is called 1523. The guy from Georgia said they had a bad week last week. We will have a bad week next week, because that bill is going to be on the House floor, the Senate floor. It should come out of committee next week. But I think we need to continue to emphasize the diversity that's already there in churches, and not just let them have this line that the woman can, all these pundits can go on and say, Jesus Christ said this,
Right.
you know?
Right.
Because there's a wide variety of what people say Jesus Christ said.
Right. Yeah,
So-
absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's why number one is like talking to the faith community,
Yeah.
getting faith voices out there. And that's
Thank
why I
you.
started off by saying, who's a person of faith in the room? Any other? Oh, yep.
Hi, I'm sorry I missed some of it. It's
okay.
a little difficult out here. I want to comment back about the religious argument and as far as being able to talk in the media and such. I'm in Richmond, Virginia, and we had a guy up there who, no matter what it was going on, he was at the press conference with his Bible in the air, white guy with his wool suit and silk tie, and a bunch of black ministers behind him, but he was the front guy. And before marriage was approved, there was a forum put together by the newspaper, and I had done research on him, and the 990 for his organization, if you don't know what that is, nonprofits have to file a 990, and there's a couple websites, one's GodStar, where you can look up their money, and their money, they had about $40-some thousand the previous year, and it showed one payout of $39,000 to this guy. And so I called him out in the forum about all of the money from this organization going in his pocket. And the moderator was sort of caught off guard. He said, we really don't let confrontation happen, so now I've got to let him respond to you, even though we don't usually do that. And so he stumbled all over, well, it's an efficient way for me to distribute the money for it all to come to me in the media side. So he's been a little less present. I don't think that I had a huge impact on that, but something has changed. So know your enemy. And the other thing is, there's an organization in Virginia called People of Faith for Equality of Virginia. So there are not a lot of progressive congregations and clergy. So if you can get them together so you're one person that is speaking in this press conference doesn't look like an outlier, And even if they don't want to do a whole lot of work on forming an organization, maybe you can do even just a Facebook page that lists those organizations. Prior to marriage, the guy that was the president of this organization went across the state finding ministers that were willing to marry. And so by the time marriage was approved, there was a list of about 50 ministers, mostly Unitarian, but from several different churches that were listed on this website. So he wasn't the progressive minister. And the messaging up there, rather than religious freedom, is license to discriminate.
So that's been tested, and license to discriminate doesn't test as well as some of the other things that I've said to you. I mean, if it slips out of your mouth, it's not the worst thing in the world. The cameras aren't going to stop, and I'm not going to like magically show up in the studio and be like, wait. But can of worms is good. Talking about opening up the floodgates, because at the end of the day, we want people thinking about our aspirational shared values, right? The golden rule, and not just saying the golden rule, but then explaining what that means and treat other people the way that we want to be treated.
I had a question about the can of worms floodgate thing, because I've only heard it from the other side being like, if we let gay people get married, then we're gonna be allowing bestiality and like non-consensual things and stuff like that. So like, I feel like that's mostly against us, no?
Yeah, so this is where we hear messaging a lot. This messaging is not designed for us. So the license to discriminate, that's the thing that we're like, yeah, you know, let's go get them. But it's not designed for us. It's designed for people like my dad, who's like a 65-year-old Republican who lives in Oklahoma City, right? So, and that's why we're using can of worms, they're using can of worms, because it resonates with a broader audience than just our base or just their base. It resonates with middle. Mine's work is. So with that, if anybody, one more, yep.
So I'm hearing a lot of the messages are just being reflections of one another. So instead of trying to fight against them, work with them. You know how you walk into a business, everybody in here, and they see that equal sign, it's equal opportunity? Why not say, okay, you can pass these bills, but any establishment has to have a symbol saying that they support that. And then have means and things that shame that. And then also go after a bill.
There was a state that did that. There's a couple of states that have done that. Oklahoma's done it, Representative Virgin, and reduced. It's so snarky.
So then when they're running around getting that fixed up, go after something that will pass through them, that protect us, like protect the Constitution bill. And then they'll go, yeah, the Constitution.
Right. Well, I mean, like, we're really smart and we're really strategic. Like, let's be real here. So were they. Okay. So a way that we got a bad bill, a religious exemption bill passed, I think it was Virginia or West Virginia, is we put a non-discrimination law in it, and we said, okay, if you're going to pass this, you're also going to pass a non-discrimination law. And they were like, whoa, wait, nope, can't do that. So I think that there are some strategy conversations, but the intention of today is really to get us thinking about how we would have a one-on-one conversation with somebody. So I brought messaging packets, but I'm so grateful to see that I don't have enough because you all are so interested. So I have digital versions of them, so I'm just gonna ask that we share them. So there's two. The first kind of gets to, yeah, if you don't mind passing around. So this one gets to what you were talking about in the back corner. This is what the opposition's doing. So this is our research on what they're doing and what's coming up next. So this is more of a briefing. This is the actual messaging booklet itself, which I'm seeing Brad like, yes, I've seen the map report. So what we're gonna do now is just huddle up into one-on-one groups. I'll trust you all to find a buddy nearby you. We're gonna take turns. Okay, so real quick, before you all start talking, real quick, is we're gonna have a one-on-one conversation about religious exemptions. So one of you is gonna say, I don't know what you're talking about, and the other person's gonna be like, let me tell you, and let me tell you why this is bad. And then you'll switch roles. So we'll do that back and forth.
a non-binary transgender person who uses they, them pronouns. I'm part of the Gender Benders, a grassroots trans organization from upstate South Carolina. And I'm going to be here helping present, and if you have any questions about my own personal experience, I only have experience being openly transgender in higher education, but I can talk some about my experience if you have any questions.
And my name is Asaf. I'm the Transgender Youth Project Staff Attorney at NCLR. We're a national LGBT civil rights organization, and I go around the country representing LGBT kids in a whole wide range of issues, but most of the issues I work on are related to transgender youth, particularly in schools, in family law, and access to health care. So obviously, we tried to make as catchy a title as possible, but really what we want to do today is sort of talk about how you approach a school district to talk about supporting trans kids in the school district, whether you're coming in as a parent, or you're working with a family because you're a mental health provider, or you're a lawyer, or you're just a community member and want to make sure that your community schools are being supportive of trans kids, regardless of whether or not you have a kid in that district. You know, the inclination of a lot of people is to go in guns blazing and say, I'm going to sue the hell out of you. And as a lawyer, that sounds awesome. I love suing school districts. But it's not usually the most helpful way to sort of build a relationship with the school district and get them to actually do what you want. And so that's really what this session is about. And I'm going to turn it over to Linus to go over some background about really starting to sort of build that foundation so you can really reduce the school's anxiety, because that's what this is all about. It's about fear. And so, take it away.
All right, so, is it on now? Okay. A lot of you probably already know this terminology, but this is terminology that school districts will often not have to talk about. Something that needs to be in the conversation is gender identity, which is a person's sense of their own gender, male, female, non-binary, agender. And everyone has this. Many people are cisgender, which is down at the bottom, and many people are transgender, which is in the middle. But regardless of whether they are cisgender or transgender, everyone does have a gender identity. There's also sexual and romantic orientation, which is a person's emotional and sexual attraction to other people, and of course there are a variety of labels for this. But this, importantly, is separate from gender identity, so not necessarily the same thing when you're working with schools. Gender expression is how a person expresses their gender, so this is style of dress, style of behavior, perhaps use of pronouns, but this is not necessarily indicative of their actual gender identity or their sexual orientation or their sex assigned at birth. So transgender is a term for people who identify with a gender different than the one that they were assigned at birth. And importantly, as an adjective, a lot of people misuse it, but it's important to use it as an adjective and not a noun or a verb. A non-binary person is a person whose gender identity is not solely male or female. Some of these people identify as transgender, some do not, but they technically fall under the trans umbrella, especially when working with laws. Transition is the process a person goes through to align their life and their body more with their felt gender. And cisgender is a person who identifies with the sex they were assigned at birth.
Linus, can I just jump in really quickly about transition? It's I think a really important switch of language that we need to make, and stop saying, you know, they transition genders, right? That sort of gives us indication that they were at some point something else, and you know, it sort of enables school districts and other folks who want to ignore a person's gender identity. The sort of sense, oh, they were male before and now they're female. No, this person was always female. You know, the doctor thought that they were going to be male based on their genitalia and based on what they saw when this infant was born. But beyond that, you know, really what the doctor was doing was taking an educated guess, and really shouldn't be given that much weight, although as a society we put a ton of weight on it. It's really just sort of like this doctor saw this and made a snap judgment without actually ever talking to the kid. So I think that's important to really sort of take that down a notch.
Thank you. So there are different stages of gender identity development, and children usually become aware of their sense of gender identity between 2 and 4 years old. So I have a niece who is 4 years old and often talks about how she can't do certain things because she's a girl, unfortunately. Though an important note, not all trans people necessarily are aware of their trans identity this young. Sometimes it happens in adolescence, sometimes it happens well into adulthood. But children can be aware of their gender identity, including trans identities, as young as 2 to 4. So children will often make statements regarding their identity that are trying to signal to others that they are in fact being misgendered by the adults in their life. And this is beyond just, how children are imaginative and might play pretend. A little girl might pretend to be a dad in a household. This is beyond that and reflects, their deeply felt gender identity. And this may be accompanied by psychological distress, as they are not allowed to live within the gender that they know themselves to be. And of course, whether or not they express this at this age, if they are aware of it, may depend on many things such as their family support. If their family reacts extremely negatively to when they first identify as this, they may, repress that and contain it and not express that to those people. And when they eventually do come out, they may come out to different people. Might only be out to certain friends and not their family, or they might be out to their family but not the school district, for example. And gender dysphoria is a psychological diagnosis in the DSM-5. It was updated from gender identity disorder. People diagnosed with gender dysphoria have basically an intense discomfort with their physical characteristics that are associated with what we refer to as biological sex. And it's very distressing for them to have this dissociation between what they feel they should have and what other people see and what they physically have. So it was updated from gender identity disorder to focus on that the problem is the pain that this feeling causes, not how these children or adults are identifying. And this is also exacerbated by social situations, so it's not solely a sort of physical incongruity problem. It's also exacerbated by, for example, people looking at someone and saying, oh, you look like a girl, therefore you have to be a girl. And in addition, not all people who are transgender do have gender dysphoria or would be diagnosed with it according to the DSM. And people's experience with it varies a lot across both social and physical domains. So the standards of care for dealing with transgender people are to affirm their gender identity and support their transition. This is very important to be able to live healthy, fulfilling lives. Social transition can include a lot of things, including name change, gender marker change, changes in gender expression, as we talked about earlier. Medical transitions can include puberty delaying medications, so these are things that children can have that basically prevent the onset of puberty while they are making, additional decisions and working through their feelings to determine exactly what they want to do with their bodies and their transition. And also may include hormone replacement therapy, various surgeries. And it is extremely unethical and harmful to try to change a person's gender identity in situations such as conversion therapy, and this is increasingly becoming prohibited as people recognize the harm that this causes. And we know several things about transgender youth and their development. So we know that being affirming of transgender youth is the most helpful thing you can do, pretty much. Rejection leads to suicide attempts, mental health issues, substance abuse, whereas acceptance leads to better resilience, better outcomes. I believe there are some findings that trans children who are very supported by their families have similar mental health outcomes to their cisgender peers. So it seems to really point to the main issue being rejection from family and society, not being transgender itself. Also, there's a lot of people who are against allowing children to transition, rely on the claim that 80% of children stop asserting a transgender identity, wind up identifying as cisgender. That is a very faulty study that used incredibly bad science to determine that number. And it's also irrelevant in the sense that at the time that children are identifying, they still need to be affirmed. And that even if you identify only a certain way for only a short period of time, it's still an important period of time in which you need to be able to feel valued and self-determined. In addition, some people try to deny that people with disabilities can identify as transgender, and this is also false. Having a disability impacts some aspects of your life, but it does not impact your ability to self-determine and define yourself.
So just want to add one other quick thing to what Linus mentioned. I think one of the, going back to the sort of early treatment, there was a study done by the Dutch that found that early intervention was key to long-term mental health, positive long-term mental health outcomes. And what that study found is that, you know, they took a cohort of about 80 kids. They all had puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and went on to surgery. And what they found that as young adults, their mental health matched that of the general Dutch population, with two exceptions, both of which I think parents will appreciate. They were less likely to live at home as adults, and they were more likely to get advanced degrees than the general population. So I think that really goes to show the importance of early affirmation. So I'm going to talk about the legal landscape and sort of weave that in with sort of how we tend to talk with school districts about affirming trans kids in school. So what we have at the federal level, we actually have quite a number of protections that cover trans folks, including non-binary, because it's all based on discrimination on the basis of sex. So there's the Equal Protection Clause in the First Amendment, as well as the right to privacy under the federal Constitution. There's Title IX, which we'll talk a lot about, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in schools, which courts and the federal government have consistently interpreted to include gender identity. There's also the Family Education Rights Privacy Act, known as FERPA, which does have some, sort of provides some legal protection, not a whole lot, but it's important to know about. And then lastly, IDEA and Section 504, which are 504 is an anti-discrimination statute on the basis of disability, and IDEA is what we know as special education law. And on the state level, you know, even in the South, there are protections. You know, the state constitutions often mirror the federal constitution, so equal protection, privacy. In some cases, particularly around privacy, the states actually have stronger protections around privacy than the federal constitution does. And then even state anti-discrimination laws. Even though, I don't know of any place in the South, with the exception of North Carolina's anti-bullying statute, that specifically prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity, but they still prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, and they also prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability, and that's been a really powerful tool that's been used in states that don't have explicit gender identity protections. All right, so what I'd like to sort of move into now is talking about each of the main areas, and I know the title really focused on the big ones, but you know, access to restrooms and locker rooms is really just one part of what trans kids need in order to be in a safe and welcoming learning environment. So names and pronouns. All right, what does the law require? The law requires that the school refer to a transgender student by their chosen name and the correct pronouns. This holds true even if there's not a court order, right? This holds true even if the student information system can't seem to handle more than one name. This holds true even though, you know, the district probably has a requirement under state law to maintain a permanent pupil record with a child's legal name as it appears on their birth certificate. Obviously, the law is not going to step in and say, you know, you discriminated against a student because there were some inadvertent slip-ups or mistakes. You used the wrong pronouns, you used the wrong name. That's going to be particularly true if they knew the student prior to their transition. My guess is judges are going to give those educators a lot more leeway in adopting, or you know, sort of give them time to practice, essentially, although it really shouldn't be that hard. That said, intentional or consistent misuse, you know, is harassment, is discrimination, whether it's by teachers or by students, and that can certainly create a hostile school environment. One thing I would encourage you all to do when you're meeting with school districts is to storytell. And it's really important because for a lot of these things that we'll go through, the adults who you're talking to will say, well, it's not that big of a deal, so you get called the wrong name once, right? But this is not something that happens to them on a regular basis, so it doesn't bother them, right? And they also don't see the harm that it causes. And so if you can storytell, it can really have an effect on how they see things. So one story that I'd like to tell with names and pronouns is I met a mom of a trans kid. Her daughter at the time was in 2nd grade, but the incidents happened in 1st grade. And her 1st grade teacher, this was in a state, not technically in the South, but it's a very conservative state in the southern part of the United States. And the teacher had sort of religious, moral, personal objections to her daughter's transition. And every time that she would put her work, display her work in the classroom, she would use the child's birth name. And the child started developing a facial tic and started causing a lot of anxiety for this kid when she would go to school. Not surprising, right? And you know, no one could really figure out why she started developing this facial tic. And eventually they figured it out. And when they went to tell the principal immediately got it. And went to the teacher and made sure it stopped. And you know, when you can really connect to an educator based on, you know, this is your profession. You didn't get into this for the money. You didn't get into it for the glory. You got into it because you want to support and help kids and help them grow, create an environment where they can learn and be themselves. That can be really moving for an educator. So what are the implementation gaps? Where does this fall through? People are really attached to this idea of a legal name. I'm a lawyer, I can't tell you what that means. What is a legal name? You know, a name's a name, right? And so, but it runs counter to cultural norms. And I think what's important too is to help people sort of step outside their comfort zone and sort of get them to really realize what the cultural norms are. If I walked in here today and you didn't have the program to tell you what my name was, and I decided I was going to tell you my name was Benjamin, you guys would probably call me Benjamin because you knew no different, unless you knew me from before today, right? Because the cultural norm is that you accept, you don't ask for a birth certificate or some form of ID before you start using someone's name. And similarly with pronouns, you know, imagine you're meeting someone for the first time, maybe you're on a bus and you're like, hey, what's in your pants so I know what pronouns to use? You'd have a really hard time meeting new people, and you'd probably have a lot of uncomfortable conversations with the police, right? Right, so we don't do that because it's not our society, right? So we just accept that. And really, what transgender folks are asking for is for that same level of respect, right? If they come to you and say, my name, yes, you used to know me as John, but I am now Jane, that you just go with that, as well as the pronouns. California, I left that up there just because there are some states, and I don't know what it is throughout the South, but some states do still accept common law name changes, which is essentially if you use your name consistently for a certain period of time, that is legally your name. Now, it's hard to sort of, you know, with the Patriot Act and other things, you know, most places now require some kind of court order, but technically it's your legal name. And then pronouns, again, you know, just sort of as a note, I think judges are going to be more likely to give leeway to educators around gender-neutral pronouns, but still, the consistent misuse, consistent or intentional misuse, is discrimination, is harassment, and you know, would violate Title IX. Any questions about that before?
I have one. On one of your slides, I think the title was what the law requires. Is that also true at higher ed levels, or is this just K-12?
Okay, great question. So the question was, does this apply just K-12 or is this also higher ed? So this is based on, you know, our interpretation of Title IX and what would be discrimination. Title IX applies to any school that receives federal funds, any. So that would include, I mean, all K-12 schools receive, all public K-12 public schools receive it. A lot of higher education institutions receive it through Pell Grants or other, you know, financial aid means, so it would apply to those schools. The one thing that I will say about private schools, in particular religious schools, there is a a religious exemption in Title IX. And what we've seen, unfortunately, in recent years, is that religious schools are seeking exemptions from the federal government to comply with Title IX around trans issues, and they're allowed to do that.
With regard to other federal programs like Medicaid, does this apply as well, that the person doesn't have to use their stated